A Girl Scout camp in rural Oklahoma would become the site of one of America's most chilling unsolved crimes. Camp Scott, tucked away in Mays County, was prepared to host scouts for a weekend of outdoor adventure. Among them were 3 girls from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Lori Lee Farmer, 8 years old, Michelle Heather, 9 years old, and Doris Denise Milner, 10 years old. But just weeks before that summer session, a disturbing warning emerged. In the camp's office, a box of donuts had been rifled through. Inside the empty box was a handwritten note in all capital letters. "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. The note was discarded, a decision that would later be heavily scrutinized. On the night of June 12th, the girls settled into tent number 7, the site furthest from counselor dorms, and partially shielded by the camp shower area, sometime in the early hours between roughly 2:30 and 3 AM. Local residents reported hearing unusual activity, such as a vehicle that passed by the camp multiple times, using a remote road. By around 6 AM on June 13th, a counsellor en route to the showers discovered a body just outside the tent area. As more staff and campers joined the search, it became horrifyingly clear all 3 girls from Tent 7 were missing, and they had been brutally attacked. They were later found along a trail leading towards the showers, about 150 yards from their tent. 2 were crumpled within a sleeping bag, 1 was lying outside. Autopsy and crime scene evidence revealed that they had been R-worded and strangled. A large red flashlight was laid on top of their bodies. A smudged fingerprint was found on its lens, and a footprint, size 9.5, was found in the blood within the tent. And this began one of the darkest chapters in Girl Scout history, an attack so heinous, so deeply personal, it would taunt investigators, families, and a nation for decades to come. The shocking murders of Lori, Michelle, and Denise brought Camp Scott to an immediate halt. The camp was evacuated, and within hours every scout was on a bus heading home. Families across Oklahoma and the county were left shaken. The idea of children being unsafe at a Girl Scout camp was unthinkable. Law enforcement descended on the scene. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation and Mays County Sheriff's Office launched one of the largest manhunts in state history. At the crime scene, investigators found disturbing clues: duct tape, rope, and a roll of black electrical tape. They also noted that the killer or killers had dragged the girls from their tent down the trail, leaving behind clear physical evidence. Despite the horror, the investigation quickly focused on one man, Gene Leroy Hart, a local Cherokee man who was a convicted rapist and had escaped from prison 4 years earlier. Gene was no stranger to law enforcement. He had previously been convicted of kidnapping and R-wording 2 pregnant women in 1966. In a chilling detail, he had bound them with duct tape and left them in the woods, a method eerily similar to the items found at the Camp Scott. Gene had escaped from Mays County Jail in 1973, and he had been a fugitive ever since, living off the grid and reportedly receiving help from some members of the local community. For investigators, the parallels between his past crimes and the evidence at Camp Scott were too strong to ignore. As word spread, the murders became more than just a local tragedy. National media arrived. The story was on every evening broadcast, and the hunt for Gene Leroy Hart would soon grow into a full-blown manhunt, unlike anything Oklahoma has ever seen. With Gene identified as the prime suspect, Oklahoma launched one of the most intensive manhunts ever. Authorities believed Hart was hiding somewhere in the rugged terrain of Cookson Hills, a remote area with caves, dense forests, and an extensive network of trails. Law enforcement, assisted by the FBI and National Guard, combed through the area for months. Helicopters scanned the woods from above, while hundreds of officers and volunteers searched on foot. Gene, however, seemed to always be one step ahead. He had lived in the wilderness before, and many suspected he was receiving shelter and support from people in the local community. The investigation grew tense. While police insisted that Gene was responsible, many of the Cherokee community felt he was being unfairly targeted because of his race and history with local law enforcement. Supporters described him as a scapegoat, pointing out that physical evidence at the time was inconclusive, so the community became deeply divided. After 10 months, the search finally came to an end. on April 6, 1978, Gene was discovered hiding in a small cabin near the home of a Cherokee medicine man. Armed officers surrounded the area and captured him without resistance. The arrest was a major breakthrough for investigators, but it was only the beginning. As the trial approached, questions about the evidence, the investigation, and whether Gene was truly guilty would spark a courtroom battle unlike any other. In March of 1979, nearly 2 years after the horrific murders at Camp Scott, Gene Leroy Hart finally stood trial. With the community divided and emotions running high, every moment of the trial was closely followed. Prosecutors argued that Gene's past crimes and his history as an escapee made him the only logical suspect. They pointed to the eerie similarities between his previous assaults and the details of the murders: duct tape, rope, and the secluded wooded setting. Investigators claim hair samples and fingerprints connected him to the crime, though forensic science in the 1970s was far less advanced than it is today. The defense, however, mounted a powerful counter-argument. They highlighted inconsistencies in the evidence and argued that the state had rushed to judgment. Supporters of Gene filled the courtroom daily, believing he had been framed because of racial prejudice and a flawed investigation. The defense stressed that the physical evidence was circumstantial at best and failed to directly link Gene to the murders. After weeks of testimony and emotional appeals, the jury deliberated. On March 30th, 1979, the verdict was read. Gene Leroy Hart was acquitted of the murders of Lori, Michelle, and Denise. The families of the victims broke down in grief, but Gene's supporters found the verdict as something to celebrate. Yet, despite his acquittal, Gene's freedom was short-lived. Because he had already been convicted of the earlier kidnapping, he was immediately returned to prison to serve a lengthy sentence. The trial ended without closure for the grieving families, and the shadow of unanswered questions only deepened. Although he was acquitted of the Girl Scout murders, Gene's story did not end in the courtroom. Immediately after his acquittal, he was sent back to prison to serve his 308-year sentence. The justice system had spared him a conviction in the Camp Scott case, but his violent past guaranteed he would never walk free. Only a few months later, in June 1979, Gene collapsed while exercising in the prison yard. At just 35 years old, he died of a heart attack. His sudden death stunned supporters and left the case in limbo, with no chance of a retrial or further interrogation. For many, it felt like the last possible lead had vanished. Even in death, Gene's connection to the case remained controversial. Investigators continued to insist that he was guilty, citing circumstantial evidence, while others argued that he had been unfairly targeted. With Gene now gone, the community was left divided between those who believed the killer had died and those who feared the real murderer was still out there. For the families of the victims, Gene's death brought no closure. They were still haunted by the unanswered questions. Why were their daughters chosen? Could the camp have prevented it after the warning note? And above all, if not Gene, then who? The case seemed frozen in time, with the evidence in storage and the wounds left wide open. But decades later, advancements in science would breathe new life into the investigation. By the 1990s and 2000s, forensic science had advanced far beyond the capabilities of the 1970s. Investigators decided to re-examine the evidence from Camp Scott using DNA testing, technology that hadn't existed at the time of the murders. Families of the 3 girls waited anxiously, hoping science might finally give them the answers that courts never could. Over the years, multiple rounds of DNA testing were conducted on semen stains, hair, and other biological samples collected from the crime scene. But the results proved frustrating. Many of the samples had degraded, making clear identification very difficult. While some partial DNA profiles suggested a link to Gene, the results were inconclusive. They could not definitively prove that he was the killer. In 2008, testing showed that 3 of the 5 samples obtained from the crime scene did match Gene's genetic markers, but the other 2 did not. The official word from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation was careful. Gene could not be ruled out, but he also could not be conclusively tied to the murders. The uncertainty only deepened the pain for the victims' families. Decades after the tragedy, the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remained technically unsolved, and with Jean long dead, the likelihood of a clear answer faded. Though the haunting question still echoed, was justice ever truly served? The murders at Camp Scott not only shattered 3 families, but they also sent shockwaves through the entire country. Parents began questioning whether summer camps, once seen as safe havens, could truly protect their children. Camp Scott itself never reopened. After the murders, the Girl Scouts permanently shut down the site. For decades, the land sat abandoned, overgrown by forest, its cabins rotting and trails reclaimed by nature. Locals began to whisper that the place was haunted, and ghost stories grew around its tragic history. In a broader sense, the case forced camps nationwide to adopt stricter security measures. Staff began taking warning signs more seriously, background checks for employees became common, and supervision standards grew a lot tighter. No longer could camps dismiss threats as mere pranks. The loss of Laurie, Michelle, and Denise became a grim reminder that danger can sometimes strike in the most innocent of places. And to this day, the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remain one of America's most haunting, unsolved cases. On that summer night in 1977, Laurie, Michelle, and Denise came to Camp Scott with dreams of adventure, friendship. Instead, their lives were stolen in a brutal act of violence that has never been fully explained. For decades, suspicion had lingered over Gene, a man with a dark past, a fugitive, and the focus of one of the largest manhunts in state history. Yet, despite circumstantial evidence and partial DNA matches, the case against him never achieved certainty, and with his death in 1979, the chance for answers died with him. As the years slipped further into history, the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remained frozen in time, a mystery unsolved, a community forever changed, and 3 young lives gone far too soon. Perhaps someday, new science or new revelations may bring some closure. But until then, this case stands as one of the most chilling reminders that even in the safest places, darkness can strike without warning. One thing I wanted to mention before ending this video is there are many theories as to what happened to them, but of course we don't know for sure. All of these are theories. And the first and most prominent theory, of course, is that Gene is responsible. It's the most logical one, considering he was an escaped convict who was at the top of the investigators' list from the very beginning. He had a long documented history of violent sexual crimes. The parallels between his previous crimes, such as in 1966, he kidnapped and assaulted 2 pregnant women, binding them with tape and abandoning them in the woods. The similarities were too strong to ignore. Investigators still believe to this day that he is responsible for the Girl Scout murders. Another theory suggests that Gene may have not acted alone, or that he wasn't involved at all, and instead multiple perpetrators carried out the murders together. This idea stems from the sheer difficulty of the crime. 3 girls asleep in their tent would have been difficult for a single person to control, silence, and move without raising alarm across camp. Investigators found evidence that the girls had been dragged from their tent towards the showers, a task that some would argue would have required more than 1 set of hands. Some locals believe there may have been accomplices, possibly people familiar with the campgrounds who could help Gene or another killer navigate the area undetected. The warning note discovered weeks earlier, eerily predicting the murder of 3 girls in Tent 1, also raises suspicions of inside knowledge. Supporters of this theory point out that while Gene was the primary suspect, no one has ever been able to conclusively prove that he acted alone, leaving open the possibility that other guilty parties slipped away entirely. A third theory speculates that the killer may have not been Gene at all, but rather someone with direct access to Camp Scott, perhaps a staff member, maintenance worker, or even someone with close ties to the Girl Scout organization. Supporters of this idea point to the chilling warning note discovered weeks before the murders, written on a piece of paper left in a donut box in the camp office. The note specifically threatened to kill 3 girls in Tent 1, eerily foreshadowing what would happen. Dismissing it as a prank at the time, camp officials threw it away, but hindsight has cast it in a far more sinister light. For this theory's believers, the level of knowledge required to move through the camp undetected suggests that the killer knew the grounds intimately, including where the girls were housed and how far they were from adult supervision. Theories about an insider are fueled by questions that remain unanswered. Why was Tent 7, located furthest from counselors, chosen? Was the killer familiar with camp schedules and layouts? And if so, was this someone who had been trusted within the camp's community? While no evidence has ever proven an inside job, the possibility lingers as one of the most unsettling alternate explanations. The last major theory is that the murders were committed by an unknown assailant, someone who was never caught, and perhaps never even seriously investigated. While Jean was the primary suspect, the inconclusive DNA evidence and the conflicting witness accounts and the lack of direct proof have kept the door open for alternative possibilities. Some argue the killer could have been a drifter passing through the area, someone with no ties to the camp or local community who vanished before law enforcement could catch them. Others suggest that the real perpetrator may have been a predator who lived nearby, but managed to remain hidden in plain sight, blending into the community and avoiding suspicion. This theory also ties into the mystery of the flashlight found on the bodies, with its fingerprints never conclusively matched to anyone. To this day, the fingerprint remains one of the most frustrating pieces of evidence, a potential key to the case that has never unlocked the truth. Ultimately, the unknown assailant theory underscores the most painful reality of the case. Nearly 50 years later, despite trials, investigations, and scientific advances, no one has ever been definitively proven guilty of the Girl Scout murders. The tragedy lingers as both a cold case and a haunting reminder of how easily innocence can be stolen, and how elusive justice can remain.